Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad that we got such a good turnout in January, and we did stuff around a little bit with the meeting date because of venue availability. So that's a little bit hard at the moment because they tend to, Microsoft's got a bunch of things running along, and they end up taking the venue for the whole day. So, but this is their new redesigned area. I don't know if you guys have been here before or not, but so my name is Bill Chestnut. I'm a cloud platform and API evangelist for 6Pivot. I'm an Azure MVP and a Microsoft certified trainer, and I've been playing with a lot of the Azure stuff, and more recently I've been playing a lot with the Azure DevOps. How many people are actually using the Azure DevOps? How many people are using the Azure DevOps server on premise? Okay. How many people are using any of like the Team Foundation server on premise? Okay, a few people. Okay. So yeah, they have released, I think, the 2019, at least a preview of the on-premise version of that. Let's see if I can get this clicker to work. Yes, that's about me. Don't worry about that. So basically, the agenda is going to be a little bit of an overview of Azure DevOps, and then I'm going to concentrate on the pipeline stuff. Because one of the interesting things is I've done some work with Team City, I've done some work with Octopus, and the latest iteration, a lot of the pipeline stuff looks like they went over and grabbed the best of those and brought them back and put them into DevOps. So, a little bit of history. How many people here ever used SourceSafe? How many of you ever had to recover a corrupted SourceSafe database? How many were so happy to see Team Foundation server in a SQL database? Yes. So a little bit of the history. So we had SourceSafe, then we had the Visual Studio Team System, then it went to Team Foundation server, then it went to Visual Studio Online, and then Visual Studio Team Services, and now Azure DevOps. So. And I guess the big reason they wanted to get away from that Visual Studio name is because it does do a lot more stuff than stuff that's in Visual Studio. So it does the pipelines for any of the open source and Git repositories and things like that. And that's one of the things I'll talk about at the end of the talk. I've got some licensing details about some of that stuff. And then what they've got in is the main components for Azure DevOps is your boards. So basically to see where you're progressing at in your builds. If you've done either a Kanban or you've done sprints, things like that, you can see where it's at. One of the big things that they're actually winning over a lot of people about is the fact that you can get a stakeholder license for it, and that stakeholder license doesn't cost you anything. But your stakeholders can see where things are at. They can also enter bugs, which a lot of people didn't realize. So they can help that. Then they've also got the repos. So basically you can go with the standard Team Foundation server repository, or you can use a Git repository. I'm torn a little bit at the moment because I've got some projects where I've got bunches of solutions in them, and typically you'll put a solution in a repo. But then if you want to do build, then your builds don't go across projects. So if you do the repo as a separate project, your builds drive you nuts. You can, though I have been working with lately, you can have sub-repos in each project. So you can have a main repo and you can have sub-repos in that project. So, but we're not going to talk about that really tonight. We're going to concentrate on the pipelines, and then I've been also doing some work recently with test plans, basically working on those to how you do testing and things like that. And then, how many people know Mitch Denny? Artifacts, that's his child at the moment. He's in charge of that at Microsoft, doing the artifacts. It used to be a package store, so it was just like NuGet packages. They've expanded it now and got their own artifact type. It doesn't have to be a NuGet package. There is another couple of artifact types in there. So if you haven't looked at that, it's worth looking at. So, the pipelines. So, a little bit of history on the pipelines. How many people had to build the workflow foundation build stuff in Team Foundation server? I built a really big custom one for BizTalk, and it was a pain. But so the good thing now is they're all tasks, and it's basically either based on PowerShell or TypeScript under the covers. And you can use the components in the build, in the release. So you can build a component that'll work in both, or you can build a component for either build or release. They also have a library component now so that you can store shared variables across builds. So if you've got multiple builds in a project, you can share variables across that. Library is also where you can store things like certificate files and key files and stuff that you need. It's kind of a secret repository where it's not in your normal repository, and it's protected at the build level. They've also got task groups. So one of the things I really liked about TeamCity is inside of your build steps, you could reference the project name. And you didn't have to put the solution name on each one of the build and the test and things like that. You could reference it by the project name variable. Azure DevOps doesn't let you do that unless you create a task group, and then you can create your own variables for that task group, and then when you add that task group to your build, you can have those variables in there. And that makes it a whole lot simpler for complex builds. Deployment groups. I haven't done much with deployment groups, but deployment groups are being able to deploy an application that has a SQL server, multiple web servers, some back-end servers, things like that. And this is more for when you're deploying on premises. So basically, each one of the servers in the deployment group has to have the deployment agent installed on it. And then basically, it's for pushing it out that way. And how many people have adopted XAML as their build? How many people have looked at it? I've looked at it a little bit. It comes from some of the other tools. I know 6pivot we were using, but it was based on a XAML build definition. The nice thing about it is if you build your build with the GUI in Azure DevOps, there's a little button over to the side that will give you the XAML for it. So if you want to do that and then actually then embed that XAML inside of your repository, you can do that. So for our agents, I'm going to go through these slides pretty quick because I just want to get in and demo some stuff, but I just wanted to cover a few of these. So here are the different agents that you get out of the box. You've got a hosted agent, which is, I think, Visual Studio 2015 still. Then they've got a Linux preview, Mac OS, hosted Visual Studio 2017, a hosted Windows container, and then that self-hosted agent. So basically, you can run it on your own virtual machine, or you can run it on your on-premise virtual machines. So you can do it that way. Now, the interesting thing about that is that I've historically been doing a bunch of stuff for BizTalk, and you can't use any of the hosted build servers because you need the BizTalk pieces installed. So I have to have a VM. But typically, most of my clients don't do regular builds, so they might do a build once a week or sometimes even once a month. So there's really no use of keeping a build server out there in Azure running all the time. So it's interesting now because inside of a build job, you can have both a combination of hosted and self-hosted in the same build job. So what I've done is I've actually got one that runs a hosted VS 2017 that runs Azure PowerShell, starts up my build server. Then the next step is a self-hosted, and basically it will wait for that build server to start and that agent to become available. Then I'll run my build, and then it comes back and does another hosted step and shuts off the build server. That shut off could be optional if you have the auto shutdown or something turned on your virtual machine. You could have that. But basically, you can do multiple. You can do a mix. I tried first to do agentless. So basically, the only problem with agentless, there's only about 6 things you can do. One of them was call an Azure function, and I was trying to use that to start my virtual machine. Except if the Azure function runs for more than 5 minutes, it fails. And sometimes it takes more than 5 minutes for that server to start, from the virtual machine to start. The newer version of the PowerShell, which didn't happen to be in that, the agentless one, lets you run it as a job, which means it comes back almost immediately. But that's the different agents we can use. And then again, from that self-hosted, you can basically put it on anything you want. So then we have our tasks. So basically, we're going to go and dig through all of the tasks. Then we've got variables, and we got variables that we can have that's defined for our job, and then we've got shared variables that we'll see later on. Triggers. How many people have a build kickoff when they commit to the repo? Even for branches. Okay. So you can do all of that with the triggers, and we'll look at the triggers in there about all the different things. You can also do schedule builds. For some of the bigger systems, you might want to do a full build on the schedule. You have some options of there of what the name of your build looks like and what kind of variables you've got in there. You also have control over how long you retain the builds. So if a build fails, I may only want to keep it for a week, but if it's a build completes successfully, I may want to keep it for a couple of months. Things like that. And then the other nice one is we got history. That way I can actually see what changes I did to my build, which comes in handy when it breaks. And you can go back and figure out what you've done to it and things like that. So let's get into the code. So if we go into our Azure DevOps, I've got a project here, which is my BizTalk build. I can look at the different builds that I have. And at the moment, I've got 4 different builds in there. If I click on that, that first one's up, so I can edit that build. Now I will do one thing to show you that the last time I tried to create a new build from scratch, let's go back and do that. It was a little bit confusing. So new build pipeline. So basically, it wants you to pick your source control, and you'll notice there is a whole myriad of source controls available. So you got the Git repository, the TFVC, GitHub, GitHub Enterprise, Subversion, Bitbucket Cloud, and basically if you've got your Git repository exposed to the internet, you can get to it from here also. So it basically gives you pretty much whatever flexibility you want in being able to do that. I have several of the things I'm working on at the moment on GitHub projects, and I'm building with the Azure pipelines from the GitHub repos. So actually, it's not doing it on that one. Let me go to a little bit different. I'm going to bring up this another repo. And you'll notice, look at the URL on that one. I've actually told it to be the new dev.azure.com/biztalkbill instead of the biztalkbill.visualstudio.com. That's a setting that you can set inside of your project. And then if I go and do a new build on this one of the things I've noticed is it threw me the first couple of times because it wanted to force me to do a YAML build definition. So let's see if it does it this time. Yep. So basically, it's asking me where my code's at. But what you have to do is you have to go down here and say use the Visual Designer, and that'll take you back out of the YAML setup. and go back to what we expect. Just wanted to show you that because the first couple of times it just threw me. Every time I kept doing something, it kept forcing me to code YAML, and that's what it was. It wasn't what I was trying to do. So I just wanted to show you that. For this one, let's go back to one of the builds I already have. And so if we hit edit on that build, and this is the one I've actually got starting the virtual machine. So this is a little bit more complicated, but basically what you see is in the pipeline there, it does a get source, so it pulls out your source, and then it has what's called jobs. And if we go up here to the pipeline level, you'll see here it says add an agent job, add an agentless job. If I go here to add an agentless job, and then I hit the plus, that 6 things are all I can put into an agentless job. So I can delay. Not sure how valuable that one's going to be right off the bat, but invoke a function, invoke a REST API, publish to Azure Service Bus, query an Azure Monitor alert, and query work items. One of the things they got that query work items for is that you might have a automated CI/CD pipeline, but you don't want to push it out if there's any open work items. So it allows you to do that query and make some adjustments there about whether you want to do the auto deploy to the next. So that's why they've got that in the agentless piece. So if you can use any of those, you're more than welcome to do. Like I said, I tried to use the Azure Function one to start the virtual machine, and I couldn't get it to work quick enough. So, but they may have fixed part of that because they just released the PowerShell v2 Azure Function stuff in preview, and it's probably got a newer version of the resource manager tasks. So let me just get rid of that agentless job. So then what we've got is we've got just a simple PowerShell task here. And basically, one of the things they did do to the PowerShell task, they added inline scripting. So you don't have to have your PowerShell somewhere else. Before, you had to have that PowerShell shoved somewhere in your repository that you could get to it. Now you can do inline. Mind you, it is not the world's greatest editor inline. Basically, it's just text. It's not doing any syntax highlighting or anything. There is another one out on the marketplace that's a little bit better in terms of that. And then basically, you select your subscription. You do have to manage in your subscriptions, if you're deploying to Azure, you have to manage and create a connection in there with some credentials. It uses your personal access token and adds access in there to that. But let's go quickly, and I'm going to skip into, we'll look at this task group. I'll come back to the task groups a little bit more, but just to show you, the task groups are basically just a series of the tasks. If I hop over to one of my other builds that doesn't have task groups, go in and edit that guy. So we just see we have an agent job that's running on an agent. The agent is the agent selection is, it inherits from the pipeline, so the pipeline's set up to use the Visual Studio 2017. But again, each agent job can have its own agent. So if you're doing cross builds where you need to do a build on a Mac or a Linux or something like that for a bigger project, you can do that. You've got all of your tasks out. You have a very good list of tasks here. And basically you can go down through, they are adding more and more tasks to this every day. Most of the source for the Microsoft ones is out on GitHub. So if you want to go look at them, you can. They've open source, put the source out there for most of those. I know guys like Octopus have already gone out and created their own tasks for saving your packages, creating the packages and saving them into Octopus. And you can see, and you've also got a really good marketplace. So if you go to marketplace, and you can do a search there, and you can go out, and there's a lot of different vendors. So there's your Octopus deploy integration task that's available out there. If you have a product, it's a very easy job to go out there and into the marketplace and create that. I know a lot of the people that have got blog posts out there about how to do something with PowerShell in the builds have actually gone and put a task out there, taken and packaged it. It's basically your PowerShell with some JSON configuration around it is what the tasks are. We'll see how we go time-wise, but we can go in and we can look at how you build your own. So basically, in this particular one, we've got a NuGet restore. I'm actually, as part of this project, I'm also doing an ARM template to deploy the resources in there if they're not already there. And I'm getting the outputs back from the ARM template. And what that does is, like, the storage keys and things like that come back to me so that I can put them in the app settings if I need to. There is a bug with the ARM templates returning output variables. It doesn't actually maintain the case that you put the variable in. So if you have a capital letter as the first letter of a variable, it makes it a lowercase when it comes back. So that breaks the variable replacement in the web config or an app settings.json file, something like that. So I've got a couple of things. There's a marketplace one that will actually take all of the output variables from your ARM deployment and put them into Azure DevOps Pipeline as variables. And then what I did is I had to do a little bit of inline PowerShell that takes the variable and makes it an uppercase version of that variable. This is a good example, though. If you have your own PowerShell, that line where I'm doing #VSO, that's how I can set a variable from a PowerShell script. So if I've had to go out somewhere to do some PowerShell work and I want to put some variables back into Azure DevOps, I can do that from PowerShell. And then basically, this is just another ARM template deployment for a logic app. Then I'm building a solution. I'm creating an archive to deploy a function app. And then I'm publishing that into the drop folder. Now, this ARM template deployment here is only a validate. So I'm not actually deploying in my build. I'm actually validating it so that I know the template's good. And then I'm going to, if we look at the release that's tied to this one, and I broke it a few minutes ago, so we won't have too much of a look through it. But basically, in there, we'll use the artifacts from that build. So let me hop back to my slides. Actually, no, let's go back to the build and edit that again. So here's where we can set our variables. So basically, I don't really have anything in there. These are the default ones that are there, but I can put whatever variables I want. Now, if I don't want to have that variable visible, I can click the little lock there, and it shows up as asterisk, so if it's a password or something like that. But one of the neat things they've done just recently is they're working at getting all that stuff into Key Vault. So you reference the Key Vault as opposed to putting that value into your deployment. So there's nothing in there. The app settings will allow you to put the link to your Key Vault. They're working on the piece in here to do that, but you can actually put it in if you're doing an Azure web app, you can actually put the app settings. There's a string you can put in there that'll reference a key vault value in there. So now the triggers is the one that people will be using a lot, is to do basically how I want to enable my continuous integration. So basically, this one here, basically I'm enabling continuous integration, but in this particular example, I'm only building for the master branch. If somebody commits another branch, it doesn't do a build. But again, you can do builds for all your branches. And what I did in another project is I built for all the branches, but I only create a release for master branch. And then we'll get to that. We'll look at that when we get to the release side of things. So we can also do a batch. Yes. Enabled, and then this right here, it will not start the build when you do a commit. Yep, that's all it means. You have to go in and you have to start a build. So basically that just says that I'm going to, whenever I do a commit to the repo, I'm going to run a build. Yep. It can be associated with a particular branch, or it can be just associated with the repo, and then you have a default branch. Okay, so let's go back to the tasks, get source. So this one's where you put the default branch. Yep. Yes. So basically what you'll see, I'll kick off one manually. You can select which branch you want to build for. And we've got another one, like I said, that builds for all the branches when you commit, but it only creates a release for the master branch. Okay. So back to triggers. The other thing we've got scheduled. We can add a schedule, and basically what days we want to do it, when we want to do it, what branches to include, all of that. And you've got all the time zone pieces there. And then you also can, let's just delete that real quick. You can also do one, let me go to this other one just real quick to show you that one, because I only have one build in that project. It's too smart for its own good sometimes. I've only got one build in that project, so it's not letting me say when another build completes. So, but here what we can do is we'll see we've got multiple builds defined in this project, and then I can basically add a build complete, and basically just it wants to know which build has to complete before I launch this build. So if you have some common stuff that anytime you build it, you want to build this guy, you can schedule and have two separate builds and have it key off when that other build completes. So that pretty much covers all of those options. You can add the filters. You can also, this path here is you can determine what part of the source tree changed. So if something at a certain level changed, that's when you want to kick a build off. If it's something at a common level that's not going to be affected by this, you can actually determine when you want to do the build. So it's pretty neat on the filtering for that. Our options, basically here we can set what a description of our build. We can set what the build number format looks like. So if you want to put things in there like the date, so that when you go and do a release, you can see when that particular build was created. And also I put the source branch in there so that I know whether it's a master branch build or whether it's a release build or whether it's one of my a test build. Let's see. So basically I can tell it how it wants to respond when it when it starts a new build, whether I want to queue and start the build when an eligible agent is there, or I want to pause, or I want to disable, not to let it queue builds. That's me. If you're working on something and you're just you don't want to do a bunch of builds because you're playing with a source repository, you might want to disable the builds for a while, because otherwise I've gone out there and I've had like 10 builds stacked up because I was changing a bunch of the stuff in the repository and committing, and it was just doing build, build, build. Also, you can have work item links to the build. So basically, if the repo recognizes that these are changes, it can link those. It can also create a work item if the build fails. So it depends on how often your build fails and who fails the build. Let's see what else we can do. And over here, these demands are what control which build agent. So if you have your own self-hosted build agents, so like normally you'll have one version of Visual Studio on that build server and you'll have things like that. You can have this build demand certain things, like you might have to have SQL on the box to do the build or something like that. For BizTalk, for me, that's what I do. I do a build, what environment is it? It's a BizTalk environment. What version of BizTalk is it? So that I can build multiple BizTalk projects across there in those demands. Then we have our retention, and that's basically how long we keep the builds for. And then the best one here is that I can see what I've changed in the build. Here I can say I can compare the differences between the builds. And you can see basically it highlights what's been changed. So typically it's one of those things, the only time you're going to really use it is if you break something. Or if all of a sudden you find somebody else has changed the build and you're a little bit nosy and you want to figure out what they did to the build. So, and that's basically what we look at in there. So again, we just basically stack our tasks. Each one of those tasks basically can have outputs, and they can pass to the next tasks and things like that. You can determine how you want to continue, things like that. Let's hop back to the slides. Yes? So if I haven't seen anything like that. There may be some stuff in the YAML that you can do that with, but I have not tried that. I did do a bunch of that in the old workflow engine, but I haven't run into a situation where I needed to do it in there. Let's go back to the slides real quick. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the release. So the nice thing is that most everything that we've seen for build applies a bit to the release also. We have the same set of agents. So you can basically do the same type of agent deployments. This time we have artifacts. So where do I get what wants to be deployed? So if you think about how many people have used Octopus Deploy? Fair few. So what you did with Octopus is you created a NuGet package and put that NuGet package in typically the Octopus NuGet server or a NuGet server somewhere. Basically, this automatically, when you publish your build artifacts at the end of your build, they go into a hidden folder in Azure DevOps, and then that's where you can get the artifacts from there. And you also, and then you've got the similar triggers. They control a little bit different things. Then you have stages. This is where you can have things like you can have dev, test, and production, and you can decide when it triggers, okay, when I do a build, I want to automatically do a release to dev. And then I want to have somebody sign off on that release to dev before it goes to test. Then I want to have about a dozen people sign off before it goes to production. So we can control all of that. Again, we have our job sections in there where they can run on different agents. We have those same set of tasks. We have some variables that we can control in there, and our retention and our history. So let's go back to our, here we'll go to a release. And so basically what I've done in here is I've picked up the artifacts out of the build. So basically it gives you a list of the available builds in this project and says, okay, the artifacts are going to come from that build. You can have multiple sets of artifacts. And then you control about whether I'm doing continuous deployment. So do I want to create a release for each build? It depends on if I am automatically want to deploy to my dev. But I can do that. This is where I can also branch filter. So maybe I only want to deploy to dev when it's a master branch. So we've done a PR. So we've done a pull request. Somebody's approved the pull request. That's done a merge and done a build to master. Then we want to deploy it. And again, we can also do a pull request trigger. So if somebody submits a pull request, we can have it deploy to a different location. So we might have a dev staging to where it's just a kind of a sandbox, so that when they do a PR, we make sure that it builds, it deploys, and everything, and then we can go test it if we need to before we go to the next environment. We can also then, at each one of the stages, we can basically say, when do I want that stage to launch? So basically, I want to do after a release is created, I automatically want to do this dev. Or I can say manual, so that basically the release gets created, but I have to go in and hit deploy. Or I can have it so that if I have another level in there like test, I want it to go out there and I want to deploy to dev, and then I want to deploy to test, but then I want to wait. I can do artifact filtering. So what artifacts changed? A schedule. So I could have a scheduled deployment. Pull request deployments. I can have pre-deployment approvals. So typically you wouldn't have a pre-deployment approval for a dev environment, but you might have for test. So the test manager gets an email and has to go in and click on that to say, yes, I want it deployed to the test environment, because they could be in the middle of testing some other stuff and not want all that testing to go bye-bye. So you can do that approvals in there. And then that becomes more and more relevant as we get to the production environments, because most likely your developers aren't going to have control of when it gets deployed to production. That's going to be a complete different group of people that can do. Yep. Yes. Yep. Stakeholders can be in there and they can approve. Yes. So basically, in each one of these, as we dig into this, is we've got dev has got a job, and that job basically says which Azure subscription that it uses. So, and I would expect most everybody to have a different subscription probably for their dev, test, and production in most cases. I know with the enterprise agreements, it was beneficial to have difference for dev and test from production, because you could actually use a cheaper billing model for Azure. You could use the dev test subscription type. But I can also have and you'll notice what I've done here is I've actually used a variable, so the release.environment name, in front of the resource group. So I deploy to even though I might deploy to a different subscription, I can also deploy into a different resource group in Azure by controlling that through whatever the name of my stage is. So it gives me a little bit of control so that I'll have like this one will do a dev, a staging, or a prod in front of the resource group name. So if you did have them all in one subscription, they would still be different resource groups. And so, in this one also, you basically, the Azure subscriptions here are based on a personal access token, so you could have multiple of those connected with different access tokens. So one has access to the dev resource group, things like that. So, and then in our variables, again, we could put in here, this is done, I've got a bunch of variables that are associated with how I want to deploy things and where the URLs are, things like that. And you'll see they've got scope on the variables. So they've got either release will cover everything, where then dev, staging, or production will cover those particular ones. Octopus does do a little bit better job with this because you can put multiples. This one you just have to repeat the value. So, but basically we can do all of that in the variables. Again, we have the same thing in terms of retention, how long I want to keep. And again, so if I'm doing deployments to dev multiple times a day, I'm not probably going to keep the same number of those as I keep production deployments. The nice thing, if I keep the production deployment, that means I can go and grab the artifacts from that production deployment and deploy that to, say, a prod QA environment or something like that if I'm having a problem and need to do some other testing. So I probably wouldn't keep the artifacts on the dev as much as I would keep the other ones. Options, not as many options here. We can control what the release name looks like. And then also the report the deployment status and things back into the repository, into work items, things like that. Yes? So into the actual, so from the release number that you create in Azure DevOps into there? Yep. Yeah, so basically you should be able to, because basically you can pass parameters to any of the deployment tools. So if you pass a parameter, you could then craft your API however you wanted to. Depends on how you're doing it. Like if I was doing this in, if I had like Azure API management there, I could. There is a PowerShell command that will create a new version or a new release of that, and I would just basically, as part of the task steps in there, I would grab that value and create a release and then deploy to that release. Depends on how you're doing it on the back end, because I mean, with APIs, there's a lot of different ways of versioning them, and how you're going to access that from there. But the thing is, if you want to put the version into, say, like the URL, that wouldn't be a problem because you have a variable that you can create the URL from. So yeah, you could do that without a problem. So it's complaining at me because I haven't picked anything there. Let me. Turn off my pre-deployment conditions. Now, these are gate. This is a gate, and this is where one of the examples they give on this was it can go out and query the work items. So if I'm going from dev to test, it'll make sure nobody's opened a work item bug against that version in dev. So it'll stop me from taking that version to test if there's a bug that's been associated with it. That would probably be more prevalent going from test to staging or staging to production. You don't want to take something that's got open work items to that. So you can have those gates in there. And again, the interesting thing about this tool is designed to work from a one-person team all the way to a 1,000-person team. So some of these things apply to the single-person teams, but majority of them apply to those bigger teams where you're doing it. And then there's a little bit of when I deploy multiples, whether how many do I want to do the deployments in parallel, or do I want to do them in sequence? Things like that. So, and let's go back to. And then I also can create my releases on a schedule. So, and that might be a case where I release if I've got really into the automated CI/CD, I release to production or release to test every night at midnight with whatever the latest build is. So, and I can go in here and I can clone a stage. So if I wanted to create dev2, so if somebody else wants to do some other testing in here, I can just clone dev to dev2, go in and update some variables, go from there. I can also do a post-deployment approval. So what I might want to do is before I go to staging, somebody has to sign off on test. Could be if it was from staging to production, it's probably your test manager to make sure they're happy with that version. They've done all the testing they want to do with it. They're happy with it. Then it'll go. And again, what I have to do in there is in my staging here is I would say after stage dev. And you see it kind of lays it out differently when I do it that way. So basically, then if I had a post-deployment approval here on dev, somebody would get an email to approve that the dev deployment worked like it's supposed to. Then they could approve that, and then it would go kick off that deployment to staging. So it pretty much gives you as much or as little automation as you want. So my recommendations are to start with very little automation. As you get more comfortable with the process, you can turn on more automation. But again, it gives you the ability, without changing everything, to be able to go in there and turn on those different levels of automation. Okay, let me hop back to the slides. So a couple of the things they've added recently is the variable sets and secrets. And the easiest way to show a little bit of that is in here. So basically for here, we've got a library. I'm just going to leave that because I don't want to change it. So what I can do is I can create a variable group. And basically, and you can restrict it to which pipelines can access the variable groups. And then here is, I didn't realize they had this, but basically there is a way to get your secrets from the key vault, which is a good thing because one of the things you don't probably want is everybody knowing the secrets. If it's in Key Vault, only the people that have access to Key Vault and the automated process are going to have access to Key Vault to get those secrets. And that way the security people can have access to change those in Key Vault. And as a developer, I don't have to worry about that. If they screw it up, it's not my problem. And I mean, because we've always had that situation with things where we're doing integrations and where we've got FTP passwords and things like that to manage. And somebody will deploy an old version of it and it'll break that. But now I can do that. I can also say I can allow certain pipelines to have access to this. And then I can get the Key Vault settings. And basically, let me see if I've got a Key Vault out there. I don't know if I've got a Key Vault out there. No, I didn't think I had a Key Vault out there. Okay. But basically, I can create the variables by themselves here, or I can create the variables where they're pulled from Key Vault. which gives me a good things there. And then let's go back to the library. The other thing that I noticed that you can do is secure files. And this is an interesting one. And it's basically for things like certificates. So if you have an ARM template process that's building a new app service and you want to upload a certificate to it so that you can do custom SSL, most people at the moment put that into their repository, which is probably not the best place for it to live, because they'll also have to put somewhere the password into that. So typically, but they've given you a place here in the DevOps. And again, the people that control those things can have access to this portion of the DevOps to upload those files to be able to maintain those. Things like that. Signing keys. So if you're making if you've got a build process or a deployment process that needs to sign your DLLs, if you're making a commercial product, you could use that here too. So that is our library. So now the task groups we're going to talk about. And the whole idea behind task groups is that I can repeat a set of steps. I might have a solution that has some projects that need custom build pieces done for them. You don't want to build the whole solution. You want to build a project and then build it a certain way. The task groups give us the ability to put those steps together. The other really neat thing about that is that bottom one, export and import. So when I do it once, and I've got another project or another repository that I need to put it in, I can export it to the other repository and then I can import it. So it gives me that ability to, especially if I've done multiple Git repositories and multiple projects in Azure DevOps, I can share those task groups across there. So let's go in and have a look at those. So if we go into our build that we had here, and we edit, and you can see create task group. So basically you can highlight the items that you want to be in that task group, and it'll go off and create a task group, let you name it, and then reference it from that build. In that other one we looked at here, you'll see that I already had in my build, it's referencing a task group. And you'll see that I can version the task groups, which is a helpful thing if I'm in the process of wanting it to do something different, but I don't want to break all of my builds. And I can also put variables. And what I'll do is we look at our task group. And say we've got a debug build here. We're passing the folder name and the solution name to that so that I don't have to go into each one of those tasks and go find the solution again. So this one basically was designed on a fact where I had a bunch of BizTalk solutions for different clients. So they were in a different folder and they had a different solution name. But I didn't want to have to build those 15 steps every single time. And I didn't want to have to go in and edit the tasks every time. I could assign a task group, go in and edit each one of them, but didn't want to do that. Because I'd build a really nice thing in TeamCity that did that, because it used the project name and the project path. So the task groups was the only way I figured out how to do that in Azure DevOps. And then that applies to all of the stuff down through there. So I'm using that. And all you have to do is create a $, variable with parentheses around it, and that the task group will automatically surface those in the build when you add it. So you have those folder path, display name, PowerShell script, solution name. Those are the variables I use in that task group, and they get surfaced here, so I enter them once instead of 15 times. So 2 things, a lot less chance of mistake if I have to enter it once than 15 times, because I've had situations where I've had those 15 steps, and I've fixed 14 of those. And all of a sudden it doesn't do what it's supposed to. So again, that's where the task groups can be done, and then you can also export and import those task groups to other projects. So, yes?
Can you use the variables in the build that can be different with the variables that we created? Or
Yes.
do you have to manually give them here?
No. This can reference the variables already in the build too. In this particular case, they weren't there yet, but yes. You can reference any of the variables in the build at this point to pass to the task group. So the reason I didn't do that is because typically you would just reference those variables inside the task group and wouldn't have to do them twice.
Oh, can we do that?
Yes. So what you would have is that inside of your task group, I think it's going to be down here probably. See, I'm referencing the built-in variables already in the task group, so there's no use of making a variable out of that and then setting it again. I still have access to all of the built-in variables and the variables that are defined in the actual build at the top level. Where I wanted to keep from having to do it is solution name is specified in there a dozen times. I didn't want to have to go select it a dozen times. But no, I can use those existing variables also. So that's the task groups. And again, the sky's the limit of what you want to do with task groups. And you can use task groups for both your build and your deployment. When you create a task group, there's really not a task group editor here. What you have to do is you have to go into your build or release, create the steps you want, highlight them, and create a task group from them. Then you can edit them. But there's no task group editor to start with. But it does have, in the task group, it has a definition of is it build, deploy, package, utility, and test, so you can put it in there so when you go to find them. That doesn't really determine where it can be used. It just determines which category it shows up with when you go to select them. And then there's you can set default values for your folder paths and things like that. So if you wanted those and descriptions. That's pretty much what we wanted to talk about with task groups. So I don't have a demo for the deployment groups, but basically the deployment groups is really targeted at on-premise deployments or deployments where you're deploying into sets of virtual machines that you've built. And basically each the target machine needs to have an agent installed on it. And then basically that agent is configured into that deployment group. And then basically so this set of 5 machines is my dev environment. These set of 5 machines are my staging environment. These set of 5 machines are a prod environment. And I can do that in there. Similar a little bit to the Octopus infrastructure setup, if you looked at that at all. This is fairly new. I think it only got released about probably 6 months ago at most. And I haven't had a chance because I don't have any infrastructure to play with because all my stuff's in Azure at the moment. And also, agents become a little bit interesting too because you get one agent for free and then you have to either buy the other ones. I'll cover a little bit off on that in the licensing, but yeah, so I've gone to most everything that I can do. If I can do it in a hosted build, I do it because there's now a lot more. So a little bit about the cost, as we all want to know, or somebody wants to know in our organization. So not long ago, they updated the number of minutes that you get for free from 240 to 1,800, which made it a lot more usable in most cases. Or you could get an unlimited single pipeline for $54.92 a month. And that gives you basically one pipeline of any of the hosted ones that just runs single-threaded. So if you want to do more, you can get multiples of those. For private projects, you can run your self-hosted build agent too, and you get one of those free with unlimited minutes, or you can get them for $20.60 a month to run that. Also, there's an interesting thing. For every person that's in your repository that has an MSDN subscription, you get another pipeline. So all of a sudden, I wondered why it wasn't complaining about one of the projects I had I had like 4 pipelines out there, and I'm going, why isn't it complaining? And then I looked and said, quantity 4. I went, okay. I hadn't bought it because it was on one of the MSDN subscriptions, which it won't let you buy an extra pipeline on. And then I started digging and read that every MSDN subscriber that's in that repository adds another pipeline. So if you've got everybody in there, you should be able to get all the pipelines you need if everybody's got MSDN subscriptions. So that helps. Now, the bottom one's an interesting one. Open source projects. You get 10 pipelines with unlimited minutes. So if you've got open source stuff, they're making a very compelling proposition to build and release your open source stuff with Azure DevOps. Because they're giving you and I mean, if the overall licensing for Azure DevOps is you get 5 free users, and then anybody that has an MSDN subscription is also a free user. And then your stakeholders are free. Your testers need either a test license or MSDN Enterprise. And that gets all the test tools. So if everybody has MSDN, it makes life a lot easier on that. And as you've noticed, you can have multiples. You just have to set them up in different subscriptions. You just have to have a bunch of Azure subscriptions, because I've got BizTalk Bill and BizTalk Bill Test, because I was playing with moving stuff between the two repositories and things like that. So let's see. I think that's pretty much. So again, 5 free users, anyone with MSDN. Pipelines can work from pretty much any repo. So right now, we've moved some of our stuff to Azure DevOps as Git repositories, and that's really easy because you just do a clone and a push. We've still got a lot of stuff in Bitbucket, but we're still doing builds in Azure DevOps. It's because one of the things I found is that, especially on smaller projects, what you ended up doing if you're doing Azure-based stuff is you ended up spinning up a VM in Azure to do your builds and your releases. And when you started looking at the cost of that, depending on how often you ran it and how often you shut it off and everything, it became a lot more expensive than even the $50 pipeline, unlimited pipeline. So, and it basically was there 24/7. You didn't have to worry about when that virtual machine was started and stopped, things like that. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense for that. I've been pinging Paul to put himself a kind of a SaaS. He's got the cloud one up there, and I think they've just added workers to that, because even though you had the cloud octopus, you still needed a virtual machine to run the agent on to do the deployments to Azure. Which kind of defeated the purpose, but a little bit. But again, if you can make your CI/CD pipelines easier to use, developers will use them more. Because basically, if it doesn't get in the way, because that's pretty much the developer approach is, if it gets in my way, I'm not going to use it. If it doesn't get in my way, okay, I'll live with it. So, if you make it easier for them to use, they will use it. And it'll make life easier. I mean, I went in and did it with some BizTalk stuff for a client, and they had a fairly large BizTalk project. They were pulling a developer off of work, and it was taking him 3 to 4 hours each time they wanted to do a full deployment. Now it does it in half an hour, and they don't have to have a developer involved because basically it's all automated. You check it in the repository, it does a build, you do the releases to your dev, their test, and their production, and just so much easier because they can. A lot of times they had issues like, okay, we've made a change in our test environment, we're testing for a particular client, but now I've got to pull that developer off to get that stuff pushed to test again. Now it's just push it. And the developer can continue doing what he does because basically it's just click buttons and wait for it to finish. A lot easier because less error prone, so they're not following a sheet of two pages of instructions that they have to do, because they will always get a phone call or something in the middle of that and skip down to, and you'll end up with a bad deployment. So easier you make it, the more likely they are to use it. Yes?
Anyone been using for
iOS like iPhone.
Yeah, because I noticed that you have a lot of Mac OS.
Yep. I haven't done it, no, but the Android ones are out there too, so you can do the whole.
Android is probably easier.
Yep.
For iOS, you use Mac.
But that's what they've done. There's a hosted Mac OS out there that you can run it on. Because I know before there was a few companies out there that would offer, they had racks and racks of Macs that you could use to do your builds on. And things like that if you didn't have them. Or you usually had somebody had a MacBook in the corner to do the builds on. So, and I just wanted to do a little bit of a plug for 6Pivot. We've got a cloud integration training course happening in February, if you're interested. Covers API management, logic apps, Azure functions, and a little bit of DevOps around that. So if you're interested in that, just ping me, and I can get you the details, sign up. We run it as a completely online course, so basically you dial in, there's a virtual machine provision for you, you can dial in. That way, as an instructor, I can see what you're doing, and I can help you out. So it's basically, yep, so we basically run that, and we run it, it's a one-day course, but we run it 2 half days. So that it's easier that if you got other things you need to be doing, you got a half a day that you can continue working on those as we do it. So we do it typically two mornings in a row. Okay, that's it. There's my details. If you need to get a hold of me, thank you very much. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yep.
Have you tried load testing? Does it provide load testing?
The test side of things does have a load tester in it.
From outside, like from one side of
The way you do the load testing is you actually do tell it how many different agents you want running the load testing and where they want to be. But the load testing, you do tell it where you want the agents placed and how many requests you want coming from each agent.
And it's done in part of the pipeline, right?
It can be done part of the pipeline. There's a load testing task, but there's also a separate one in the test plan side of things for doing load testing. Yep. So, yep. Yes. Yep.
How is it going to work? Like these different container service, whatever it is?
For the deployment? Yeah. So basically, So the integration tests become a little bit more interesting when you've got things deployed all over the place. So basically, you will have to have a point where you've deployed everything. You've done your unit testing at your container level, basically. And then once you've deployed everything, you will have to have some steps in there that know the configuration of where everything's at to run those tests. That'll probably have to be in your release pipeline. So typically your unit testing's in your build, but you could have your the other one, the integration tests at your release pipeline. And again, you could do that only in your dev and your test release pipelines. It also depends on when you're like deploying things like web apps. One of the options on the web app deployment is production-like, or I can't remember the exact wording, but basically it uses the staging configuration, but the production code, so that you can hit it without adding data to your production environment, and then you do a swap at the end, and you can do those swaps. There's tasks in the release agent to do those swaps, because a lot of people want to do a little bit of that to warm up the ASP.NET stuff. So you don't want it to have that long load time in the first request. You warm it up first and then do a swap. So you would have to have all that information in your release pipeline, and then decide which environments you want to do that full integration testing in. And I think functions are now supporting slots too, so you could do the testing all the way across, depending on what you had. And one of the hosted agents there is a container too, so if you want to have all your build stuff in a container at the same stuff too, you could just run that container.
I saw there is a clone functionality on your stage.
Yep.
Is that possible to clone the whole microservice environment, like take a whole like a cluster?
That clone only clones the one of those, yeah.
Is that functionality available?
You can clone the whole release. You can clone the whole release. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you could do that. So it's pretty much given you most of the things you need to do it. It's just a matter of getting it done. The biggest thing I find with a lot of the integration tests is having all of the environments that you need for the back ends and stuff to be able to do a test that doesn't hit your production environments. And that's the biggest issue typically. So, any other questions? Yes.
So basically, we've been moving our build and release pipelines from Bamboo to the STS over the last several months.
Yep.
And one of the sort of things that we want to try to solve at this point is we've got access to modify the release and build pipelines to a small set of people, but we want to expand it out to be to pretty much all the developers. But at that point, we kind of want to have some kind of pull request-like system to manage that. So for the build pipeline, that's a solved problem because we have the it's managed in the XAML file.
Yep, YAML file. Yep.
The release pipeline, are you aware of any equivalent to that where we would actually be able to have some kind of approval or at least some visibility on when someone makes changes?
You've got visibility, but you won't have an alert when somebody makes, because that's probably what you're wanting. You're wanting to get some sort of notification that somebody's made a change.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if there's a service hook. So there's a bunch of service hooks behind the scenes for Azure DevOps. So like when a build completes, you can get a service hook, and that you can send that to your Slack channel and all that kind of stuff. I don't know whether I'll have to look. Just drop me your email, and I'll have a look to see if there's a service hook to where you could get notified through a Slack channel that somebody's updated the release. Yeah. Well, but it's all part of the Azure DevOps, so it's not really in source. But I haven't seen the release stuff in YAML yet. The build's in YAML. Yeah. Yes.
When it's done, you can
add those service to Slack?
Yep. So what we did, we took a little bit different approach. We wanted a fancier message. So what we did is we sent the service hook to a Logic app, did some massaging of it till we got a lot prettier Slack message. But basically, yes, you can send that service hook to any kind of webhook endpoint that says the build's completed. Yep. Well, it basically just tells you about it and gives you links.
That was actually a question I was going to ask you.
Yep.
The crowd. Who here is interested in that kind of stuff? Sending hooks to things like Slack. Is that what you do already?
Yes.
And who would be interested in doing that kind of stuff? What about going the other way, triggering stuff in Slack on the SCS, triggering hooks, weird. That's all I'm doing.
So there's the ones that are out there that I see at the moment.
You can actually click on new subscription and you can customize your notifications in here. So for example, let's say release is completed. By default, there is no notification for it, but you can create one. Yeah.
Yep.
I believe most of them is just email. It doesn't. It's just email. I did find the book to.
Hold on, there is. We're just gonna service hooks here. There's notifications in their service hooks, two different things. So the notification will spam you, which we all really get lots of those already. Anyway, come on, load. But the service hook basically is going to ask for a endpoint. If it ever, okay. Create a subscription. So basically, here is your endpoint that you want it to go to. So there's Slack, and then go next, and then there is the list of and so like there's the build complete, and you can filter by pipeline and status, and then next. Basically, it's asking you for a webhook, and basically you go into Slack and you create a webhook, and basically for a particular channel, and you go bang, and that shows up in the Slack channel. So notifications, that's email, yes. The subscriptions under the service hooks is for passing the data in raw, and I think that what do we have to do? One of the reasons we went with Logic apps is you can get multiple entries in a webhook call. It comes in as an array, so you need to go for each through it, and then configure whatever the hook you want to. So, but yeah, so the service hooks is a way that you can do that, and they've got. When you do that, you'll see that they've got service hooks to a fair few things. That you can have that there. So, and again, basically it's a webhook, so you can write anything you want to accept the data. It's just a JSON payload that you get on an end of a webhook. Any other questions? You had a question earlier?
Cloud-based deployment.
Yep.
Can do SQL Server. How about Oracle? Basically, working with team told me that it can't be done, and I have to.
Can be done Oracle. You could do it with a function. Because I mean, if you think about the function, you pass it a payload of something, and then you've got all of the ability to write code in there to do whatever you need to do. Because I mean, I'm sure there's programmatic ways of doing that Oracle deployment in code. Because basically, most of the time, database deployment stuff is running SQL scripts. So, I mean, there's probably nothing right out of the box except what you do is check with some of the Oracle tool vendors. Somebody's built that kind of stuff. So like Redgate has built a lot of the SQL stuff, SQL deployment stuff. I'm sure they've got some Oracle stuff. Yeah, yeah. He's the tool that they're using at the moment. He gets an email, go do this.
So they basically, my team would do their deployment to the apps and the SQL Server, but because Oracle is single out, so I have to do my first and then do it.
Yep. So I mean, yeah, it just depends on how complex stuff you're doing. If it's adding tables, adding columns, things like that, yeah, you could probably write a pretty simple little function that you just hit with because you noticed in there you've got that column Azure function. So you pass the parameter file or whatever, or even just the location of where the file's at, and have it go off and do that, come back finished, and then go to your next step.
Don't forget it fails after 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Just to figure out how to do this.
You get an actual agent yourself. You can touch on the server. You can write PowerShell scripts, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Power. You should be able to do it with PowerShell because you should be able to launch something under PowerShell to do it, and then you can do that the on-premise PowerShell agent. Yeah. So. Yeah. If you can do it in code, you can do it some way through this because you can launch the code through PowerShell or any of the things that you want to use. Okay. Any other questions? Yep.
Like a community build version like a Jenkins or the other build tools, and how the Jenkins compare to Azure DevOps?
I can honestly say I've never used Jenkins. Sorry. I don't know. Does anybody else use Jenkins to know how that compares?
For example, Jenkins, if you want to use Jenkins, you will
Yep, but kind of comparison about what Jenkins can do and what Azure DevOps can do.
Once you open the account, and you can use it straight away. So, on the other hand, if you want to use Jenkins, you have to set up by yourself everything from the scratch. So testing everything. And also, if something is that if you can want to use in Jenkins, or something functionality, I'm pretty sure almost all functionality can be done within.
Jenkins is in the field.
Okay. Yeah, so a couple of the places I've done, they've moved from Jenkins to Azure DevOps. Okay, thank you very much.